Hey, what's up, party pagans? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I am excited to be back on the Atheopagan YouTube channel. I bring up my real life job because we're going to talk about some psychology concepts when I'm on here. That's very much what I like talking about: mental health, neurodivergence, religious trauma, relationships, all that fun stuff. So today we're going to talk about imposter syndrome. Are you even a real pagan? You don't do tarot or use crystals. You don't have your gods and goddesses. I love this concept of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is one of those cultural concepts that is not a real psychological thing. Diagnosis, I guess, is what I mean to say there. It's not something that's in the DSM, and the DSM is deeply flawed, but also like it's not an agreed upon thing. It's not something that multiple professionals from different backgrounds have gotten together to say, hey, this is how we define this thing. It's just one of those things that has entered the cultural zeitgeist of like gaslighting and neurospicy and like some of these things that catch on as trends or cultural phenomenons that don't really have an agreed upon meaning. So they end up kind of meaning everything and also nothing at all. So imposter syndrome is loosely defined as this idea that people, often high achieving people, are feeling like they aren't doing enough, aren't good enough, aren't real enough, aren't big enough, aren't doing the things correctly in order enough. It's this vague sense of there is some right way to be doing things, and whatever that is unattainable or not able to kind of maintain that level of success with it. And I think it plays out in a lot of religious groups. I'm coming to Atheopaganism from a conservative Christian background, leaving high control religion, doing the whole angry atheist thing for a while, and then landing somewhere with atheist leaning paganism, like atheist forward paganism. And so atheopaganism is really comfortable for me. But in starting to dip into pagan spaces, like there are things where I'm like, oh, well, like I'm not that pagan, and not in a judgy way, not in a way where it's like you can't do those things, but in this way of like, is there a right or wrong way to do paganism? And I think for a lot of folks, the initial answer is no. Um, but depending on how dogmatic of a culture you grew up in, even if you grew up atheist, even if you grew up pagan, if you were very fundamentalist or dogmatic about that approach, like there is one correct way to do it, and there are a bunch of incorrect ways to do it. Our little group is the one that's doing it the bestest, and so we're correct it, and everyone else who isn't doing it this way is wrong. And that's definitely a feature in high control religions. When you look at some of the fundamentalist religions in Christianity, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, certainly sects of any religion can be fundamentalist, which is just basically saying our way is the only correct way. So in Christianity, it's my fundamentalism I grew up in was literal interpretation of the Bible. It is God's word. It is inerrant. Therefore, we have to translate it as such, and that's God's word. Young Earth creationism, etc., etc. All sorts of problems with that. All sorts of contradictions in these spiritual things. Lack of science, lack of history, lack of taking marginalized communities into account. Organized religion is very much about social control, and so creating order, having these hierarchies is very important to those things. So one of the things that I think is nice about atheopaganism, and one of the things that I think can be very freeing about paganism, is it's not that. And yet, even without those hierarchies, without those socially constructed restrictions, what can still happen is this idea of like enough. Sometimes without structure, our brain goes, oh, other people are doing more or better than we are, and that imposter syndrome thing starts to kick in. It's hard to talk about a topic without using the topic, like imposter syndrome, but it's not a real thing, so we don't want to like add to it and be like, see, this is how it works. But there's this idea that there's a blueprint out there and we don't have access to this. Now, I work with a lot of neurodivergent folks. I have ADHD myself, and I think it's one of those things that depending on where you are in that neurotypical neurodivergent spectrum, depending on how many resources you had, how good you were at learning how to manage your own brain chemistry and some of the symptoms you were maybe dealing with, depending on how well you masked and how well you were rewarded for some of that stuff. You may have been able to do really well. Like I was one of those kids who was bored to tears in school and also was 3 weeks ahead and got A's without studying, and like it never made sense to me, right? Like I didn't understand why. And so it was really hard for me to have any meaning behind it. And so it was always kind of this idea of like, well, it seems like this stuff is meaningful to everyone else, but I don't get it. So like I must be doing it wrong. And again, I was raised fundamentalist. So certainly that idea of like, I must be doing it wrong was really ingrained. But not really understanding social norms and dynamics in that. So when I had friends, I was like, I don't really understand why I'm popular. And when I didn't have friends, I also didn't understand why I didn't have friends. And so being like, it must be me, like, right there, that's the common denominator in these things. And so as we're developing, this idea of the universe kind of revolves around our personal experience is a normal developmental pattern we go through. And that can be somewhere between, post adolescence, we could be 8, 9, through our teenage years. And we also go through a version much younger than that, kind of in that like 1 to 3 year old range, roughly. I mean, people develop at different rates. And so this idea that the world revolves around our personal experience is one of those things. That's why teenagers often have like a very high sense of right and wrong, and also just lack the life experience to back it up. So they're very confident in the things that they believe. And also the adults who've gone through more are kind of like, well, sure, we'll see how much of that sticks. So these are good developmental patterns to go through, but when you're like going through that pattern and you're kind of internalizing that like everybody else is doing it right and I'm doing it wrong, that's where some of those things like perfectionist tendencies and some of these things that end up looking a lot like imposter syndrome pop up. So I think one of the things that we have to be aware of is like being curious about people's spaces. It's okay to practice the way you want to practice. It's okay that things that are meaningful to you might not be meaningful to everyone else. I just got my first tarot deck the other day, and like that's cool. It's something that helps me focus and gives my brain a pattern to focus on, but it's not super meaningful. It's connected to the Tetris effect in my brain, which is that the psychological concept that our brains are very good at finding patterns, and as we find patterns, we learn new patterns. So they studied this with the game of Tetris. They would change the colors and shapes, and your brain can learn the new pattern of colors and shapes. And actually, the more time you spend with each pattern, the better your brain gets at recognizing patterns. So actually, uh, the skill that is built within your brain is pattern recognition. Not that you recognize that pattern the best, but that you actually get better at recognizing patterns. And so the longer we stick with patterns and the more that we like challenge ourselves to look for different patterns, our brain can actually get better at finding patterns. So like something like tarot for me is nice for that reason. There are people who it's a very meaningful, spiritual, connective practice, and like one is not better than the other, right? It's just that reality that different people are going to relate to it differently. And so creating space for those things, I think combating imposter syndrome is often based on like fact finding. So if you're in the workplace and you're doing really well in your job and you still feel like an imposter, like we could be use some cognitive skills around like, well, what does the evidence say? Well, evidence says you've been promoted, you're really young for your position, you're doing really well, you got great job review, et cetera, et cetera. With something like spirituality, like it's harder to quantify. It's meaningful to you because something in your brain reward center goes off when you do this thing. This is tied to a thing that you like or a fond memory or whatever it is. So like, I love learning new things. I love these psychological concepts. My brain likes connecting different dots. And so if I use something like tarot to connect to the psychological concept that also I liked learning about, or I was in a good headspace when I learned about, or whatever it is, like I get a reward from that. But that might be different than someone who's been specifically trained to do tarot readings, or has someone in their family who does them, or it's very meaningful to them for whatever reason that it's meaningful to them. So I think a practice like Atheopaganism is really nice because it's very freeing, and also with that freedom comes some level of analysis paralysis. And so being aware of those things, being aware that there is no right or wrong, and that's just a false premise. That's a false dichotomy from the get-go. And so presupposing that there is a correct or an incorrect way, a better or worse way to be a pagan, to experience meaning making within your life, I think is, we want to challenge that. We want to catch that premise and push back on it and say, like, oh, it's meaningful to me because this is the meaning I attach to it. And that's really freeing. And I think that building community around that idea and having space for people to experience these things differently is really wonderful. The in-group, out-group dynamics that our brains are wired for, our brains are wired for community, but also within that community comes these implicit biases of we're different in these ways, or we're similar in these ways. Similar people grouped together, dissimilar people are kept separate. And so, whether it's high control religion, or it's ex-evangelical, or you're raised atheist, or new atheist versus atheist, or, you're a white witch, or you're a druid, or whatever it is, like, we have these categories that we like to use, and we need to be wary of these arbitrary groups, these implicit biases that could come in, and say there's a right or wrong way to do it, and then check with ourselves first, right? Because ultimately that's all we can control. We can't control other people. We can't necessarily, often we're not in a position where we can influence change within a group, but we can say, hey, starting with me, I don't want to have that feeling of right or wrong. I don't want to have that feeling that there is, I'm not doing it enough, whatever that means. And then as a community, with individuals who are checking on themselves and holding themselves accountable, we can start to build community out. And that's where change can come in. So, getting a little preachy here. I don't mean to. But yeah, it's one of those things that it's an interesting concept. I think it's grown within cultural awareness because a lot of people experience this idea of enough. But it's kind of pulling on those threads a little bit and asking, where's that come from? Is that really based on anything? And giving ourselves permission to build things that are meaningful, to own that meaning is arbitrary. And that doesn't mean it's powerless. That just means it's arbitrary. It's up to us to make our own meaning, and we can create that through relationships with items, with nature, with other people, with animals, whatever it is. That meaning making is the thing that's built and constructed, and we can be intentional about that, and actually setting that intention can actually make more meaning. So I hope this made some sort of sense. And hopefully it was interesting and useful. If you can relate or you have questions, drop down in the comments. Love to interact with folks. Hopefully this stuff is relevant and interesting. If there are topics that you would like to hear any of us over at the YouTube channel do, drop those down in the comments. If there's anything you'd like to hear me talk about, the intersection between spirituality and psychology, Atheopaganism and psychology, mental health, neurodivergence, all that stuff. There's a lot of overlap here. There's a lot of the stuff that I like to talk about, but when you do it regularly, it's part of your job. You forget what might be interesting or new or fun to learn about for people. So try and keep it interesting, try and keep it fresh. Thanks so much for stopping by today, giving us some of your time and participating in the community. Take care, everybody. Peace.